I remember the moment like it was yesterday. We were sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in each of our hands, the soft glow of the TV casting a warm light over us. We had been married for nearly 7 years, and our life together had settled into a predictable rhythm. Comfortable, safe, but maybe a little too safe. She turned to me, and her voice, normally so soft and sweet, held a strange tension. "Hey, can we talk about something?" Her eyes avoided mine, flicking nervously to the TV screen. My stomach knotted immediately. Those words never led anywhere good. "Of course," I replied, trying to sound calm, even though I knew this conversation would change everything. "I've been thinking," she started, and I could see her fiddling with the stem of her wine glass. "About our marriage. About how things have become kind of predictable. I mean, don't you think we're in a rut? It's not as exciting as it used to be." I felt my heart sink. I knew we weren't as passionate as we once were, but I never imagined she felt things had gone so stale that she'd want to change something fundamental. Still, I wasn't prepared for what came next. "I've been reading up on this concept," she continued, her voice wavering slightly. "About open marriages. I've been thinking maybe if we open things up a bit, it could bring some excitement back. For both of us." I stared at her, completely caught off guard. An open marriage? It was something I had heard of in passing, but it always seemed like something people far removed from our circle did. I never imagined my wife would even suggest such a thing. "You want to see other people?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. I could feel my grip tightening on the wine glass as 1,000 questions swirled in my head. Had she already met someone? Was she bored of me? She shook her head quickly, her eyes finally meeting mine. "Not like that. I mean, yes, but it's not about replacing you or finding someone else. It's just about exploring. We'd still be each other's number one. We'd still be married, but maybe with some extra freedom." Her voice had a pleading tone, like she was hoping I would see this as some grand opportunity for us both. But I didn't. All I could hear was that she wanted more than what I was giving her. "Who brought this up?" I asked, knowing the answer before she said it. "Lisa." Of course, it was her best friend, Lisa. Always the wild one. Always pushing boundaries and bringing chaos into our otherwise quiet lives. Lisa had been in multiple relationships and was currently on her 3rd open marriage. I should have seen this coming. But my wife, I didn't think she'd ever be the one to suggest it. I wanted to say no. I wanted to scream that this was a terrible idea. But something held me back. Maybe it was the fear of losing her if I didn't give her what she wanted. Maybe a small part of me was curious about what an open marriage could look like. "What if one of us gets hurt?" I asked, my voice soft but firm. She set her glass down and leaned in, her hand on my arm. "We won't. I love you, and that won't change. This isn't about love, it's about adventure. We could have rules, boundaries. We'd be careful, and we'd talk through everything. It's just a way to spice things up, to bring back that fire we had when we first met." Her words felt rehearsed, like she'd been planning this conversation for a long time. She had thought this through, maybe too much. "Think about it," she said, her voice gentle. "I just want us to be happy, to keep growing." I nodded, though my mind was racing. It wasn't a decision I could make right there on the spot. We finished our wine in silence, but my world was already beginning to shift. That night, lying in bed beside her, I stared at the ceiling. All I could think about was whether this would destroy us or save us. The truth was, our sex life hadn't been the same for a while, but was this really the answer? I knew I needed time to process it, to understand what I was truly feeling. But deep down, a small voice was telling me that nothing would ever be the same again. Over the next few days, her proposal lingered in the back of my mind like an unwanted guest. We hadn't discussed it again, but the tension between us was undeniable. She seemed lighter, almost hopeful, like she was waiting for me to give her the green light. Meanwhile, I felt like I was carrying a weight I couldn't shake off. At work, I couldn't focus. Every glance at my phone, every text from her, felt like a reminder of the conversation we hadn't finished. Was I really considering this? A voice in my head kept telling me I wasn't enough for her anymore, that this was her way of trying to find something outside of us. Then, one evening, as we sat down for dinner, I decided to confront it. Have you thought more about what we talked about? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, though my heart was pounding. Her eyes brightened immediately, and I realized she'd been waiting for this. I have, she said, placing her fork down carefully. But I don't want to rush you into anything. This is about both of us. You have to feel comfortable, too. Comfortable? I wasn't sure I'd ever feel comfortable with the idea of my wife being with another man, but I swallowed my doubts. I've thought about it, too, I said slowly. And I'm open to trying. But we need rules. Boundaries. Her face lit up, and she reached across the table to take my hand. Of course. I wouldn't want it any other way. We'll talk through everything. We'll make sure neither of us gets hurt. It was the reassurance I needed, though I still couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. Over the next week, we laid down ground rules. Nothing serious. No emotional attachments. We'd be completely honest with each other about who we were seeing and when. If either of us felt uncomfortable, we could pull the plug at any time. And most importantly, we'd stay each other's priority. Our marriage would always come first. But as much as we tried to make it sound like a reasonable, controlled decision, something inside me was screaming that this was a mistake. It didn't take long for things to move forward. She was the first to meet someone. His name was Andrew, a guy she met through mutual friends. She had mentioned him once or twice before, but now there was something different in the way she spoke about him, a spark I hadn't seen in a while. He's nice, she said one evening as we sat on the couch, scrolling through our phones. Funny, charming, but it's just fun, nothing serious. I nodded, trying to hide the jealousy gnawing at my insides. She'd arranged to meet him the next day, and I pretended to be fine with it. This was what I had agreed to, after all. The night she went out with him was one of the longest nights of my life. I stayed home, trying to distract myself with a movie, but I couldn't focus. Every time my phone buzzed, I checked it, wondering if she was texting to tell me it wasn't working out. But the hours passed in silence. When she finally came home, it was late. I was sitting in the living room, pretending to read a book, when I heard the door click open. She walked in, smiling, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and sat beside me. How was it? I asked, trying to sound casual, though my heart was racing. It was good, she said, her eyes avoiding mine. We just talked mostly. It wasn't weird, I promise. I nodded, but I could feel the distance between us growing, even as she reassured me. That night in bed, we didn't touch. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what the hell I had gotten myself into. The weeks that followed were strange. She saw Andrew a few more times, always assuring me it was just casual, just fun. But something had shifted between us. It was subtle at first, a miskiss before work, less laughter when we talked. Our sex life, which had already been suffering, became nearly non-existent. It was as though the more freedom we gave each other, the further apart we drifted. Then, one day, she dropped a bombshell. "I'm late," she said, her voice barely a whisper. We were standing in the kitchen, and I had been halfway through making coffee when the words hit me like a truck. "What do you mean late?" I asked, my heart sinking as I turned to face her. "I haven't had my period in over a month," she said, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the countertop. "I am scared." 1,000 thoughts rushed through my mind. Was it mine? Or his? Or someone else's? The ground felt like it was shifting beneath me, and suddenly the idea of an open marriage felt like the stupidest, most reckless decision we had ever made. "We need to get a test," I said, my voice tight. The next few hours were a blur. We drove to the pharmacy in silence, barely speaking, both of us lost in our thoughts. When we got home, she disappeared into the bathroom with the pregnancy test, leaving me standing in the hallway, staring at the closed door, my heart pounding in my chest. When she came out, her face told me everything. "It's positive," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. I stood there frozen, the reality of the situation crashing down on me like a tidal wave. She was pregnant, and we had no idea who the father was. The days that followed felt like I was living in some kind of twisted dream, a version of my life that didn't belong to me anymore. We were walking on eggshells around each other, avoiding the one question that hung in the air, unspoken but suffocating. Whose baby was it? She was quieter than usual, withdrawn. Even her vibrant energy, the spark that had once drawn me to her, seemed dulled by the weight of what was happening. I wasn't sure how to talk to her anymore. Part of me still loved her, still wanted to believe this was a temporary storm we could weather. But another part of me, an angry, bitter part, resented her for dragging us into this mess. And worst of all, I wasn't sure how much of that anger was directed at her, or at myself for agreeing to the open marriage in the first place. One evening, as we sat in the living room, the tension unbearable, I finally brought it up. "We need to figure this out," I said, my voice strained but steady. "The baby." She glanced up at me, her face pale and drawn, dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've been thinking about it. We need to do a paternity test as soon as we can." There was the moment of truth, the point where everything could either start to make sense or fall apart even more. I had tried not to let my mind wander to Andrew, tried not to imagine my wife carrying his child. But the thought haunted me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. We scheduled the test for as soon as it was possible. The doctor explained the process, and we both agreed to the invasive procedure, desperate to know the truth. It was a strange, sterile setting, the complete opposite of the chaotic emotions swirling between us. After the test, the waiting felt unbearable. Days stretched into an agonizing eternity as we continued our quiet dance around each other, both of us pretending to go about our daily lives while the truth loomed over us, ready to crash down at any moment. Then the call came. I was at work when she called me, her voice shaky. "I have the results," she said, and I could hear the fear in her words. I drove home faster than I should have, my heart pounding the whole way. When I walked into the house, she was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she held the printed results in front of her. "It's not Andrew," she whispered, her voice breaking. I should have felt relief, but I didn't. Something about the way she said it made my stomach drop. She wasn't relieved. If anything, she looked even more terrified than before. "Then, who?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed on the table, tears spilling down her cheeks. "There's someone else," she finally said, her voice cracking with guilt. "Someone I didn't tell you about." The room spun. I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself, my knuckles white from the strain. "What do you mean, someone else?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. One lover, I had agreed to. We had rules, boundaries. But this was betrayal. "I didn't plan for it to happen," she said, her voice barely audible. "It was just once, and I didn't think it would matter." "I didn't think—" "You didn't think?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "You didn't think that sleeping with another man outside of our agreement would matter? Who is he? How many secrets are you keeping from me?" She sobbed openly now, her face buried in her hands. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "It was a mistake. I was confused, and everything was happening so fast. I didn't know how to stop it." I felt rage bubbling inside me, hotter than anything I had ever felt. This wasn't just about the open marriage anymore. This was about betrayal. She had lied to me, broken our trust. The very foundation of what we had left had crumbled, and I wasn't sure how we could ever recover. "Who is he?" I demanded again, my voice sharp with anger. "His name is Mark," she whispered. "We met at a party Lisa invited me to. I didn't mean for it to happen." Lisa again. Of course. My blood boiled at the mention of her name, but I couldn't focus on that now. This was about the man, this stranger who had slept with my wife, the father of her child. "How long have you been hiding this?" I asked, my voice low and dangerous. "Since the night it happened," she admitted, finally meeting my eyes. Her gaze was full of shame, but it wasn't enough to cool the fury building inside me. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I had to breathe. "I need space," I said, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. "I can't stay here right now." Without waiting for her response, I grabbed my keys and stormed out of the house. My mind was spinning, heart racing. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, trying to clear my head, trying to figure out how everything had gone so horribly wrong. The thought of revenge hit me before I could even process it fully. If she could do this to me, sleep with multiple men, lie to me about it, destroy our marriage, then why shouldn't I take something from her in return? Why shouldn't I make her feel the same pain, the same sense of betrayal? And then it hit me, her best friend. I could see the image of her friend vividly. Amanda, beautiful and vibrant, someone I had always noticed but never pursued out of respect for my wife. But now, why should I hold back? After all, respect seemed to mean nothing in our marriage anymore. The idea burned inside me like a spark ready to catch fire. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I drove to a hotel across town, my thoughts tangled in a mix of rage, betrayal, and the burning need for revenge. I couldn't shake the image of my wife in another man's arms, Mark, Andrew, whoever. It didn't matter. They all felt like ghosts hovering over the ruins of our marriage. But there was one thought that kept coming back, clearer than the rest. Amanda. Amanda had always been close to my wife. They were best friends, practically inseparable since college. And yet, there was something different about Amanda. While my wife and I had settled into the dull comfort of routine, Amanda had always seemed free, wild even. She was confident, always the life of the party, with her sly smiles and effortless charm. I had noticed her more than once, but I never acted on it. It didn't feel right, not back then. Now all of that had changed. The next day, after spending a restless night tossing and turning in the unfamiliar hotel bed, I woke up with a new clarity. If my wife could betray me, if she could bring another man's child into our marriage, then why couldn't I take something from her? Why couldn't I cross a line of my own? It was late afternoon when I decided to reach out. I found Amanda's number in my phone, sent her a casual message asking if she wanted to grab a drink and catch up. To my surprise, or maybe it was something I had secretly expected, she responded quickly, saying she'd love to meet. She suggested a trendy bar downtown, the kind of place she and my wife used to frequent together. As I got dressed, I could feel my pulse quickening. This was more than just an act of revenge. It was a chance to reclaim some control, to take back the power I felt I had lost. My wife had thrown us into this mess, and if she could break the rules, why shouldn't I? When I walked into the bar that evening, I spotted Amanda immediately. She was sitting at a high-top table near the window, wearing a tight black dress that hugged her curves, her blonde hair perfectly styled. She looked up as I approached, flashing me a playful smile. "Hey, stranger," she said, her voice smooth and confident. "It's been a while." I smiled back, though I felt the tension simmering just beneath my skin. "Yeah, it has." We made small talk at first, work, life, the usual pleasantries, but there was an underlying current between us, something electric that hadn't been there before. I could see it in the way she looked at me, the way her eyes lingered a little too long on mine, the way she leaned in closer as the night went on. There was no mention of my wife, no talk about what was happening at home. It was as though we had silently agreed that this was something different, something outside of the mess we had both been dragged into. After a few drinks, the conversation shifted. Amanda's hand brushed against mine, and I felt the spark I had been waiting for. "You know," she said, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone, "I've always wondered what you're like when you're not being the good husband." Her words hung in the air between us, charged with meaning. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, the pull of temptation growing stronger. This was it, the point of no return. I leaned in, my voice low. "Maybe it's time you found out." Her lips curled into a smile, and before I knew it, we were leaving the bar, heading back to my hotel room. The elevator ride up was silent, but filled with tension. I could feel the weight of what I was about to do, the line I was about to cross. But I didn't care. All I could think about was the satisfaction I'd get from it, from knowing that my wife would never expect this, that she would never see it coming. When we got to the room, Amanda didn't waste any time. As soon as the door clicked shut, she turned to me, her hands sliding up my chest, pulling me closer. Her lips found mine, and the kiss was hungry, urgent, full of a passion I hadn't felt in years. The moment was raw, unfiltered. Everything I had been holding back, my anger, my pain, my need for revenge, it all exploded in that room. I wasn't thinking about my wife. I wasn't thinking about the mess we were in or the baby that might not be mine. I was only thinking about Amanda and the way she felt against me, the way her body moved with mine. The sex was intense, almost primal. It wasn't about love or connection. It was about reclaiming something I had lost, my pride, my sense of control. Every kiss, every touch, every moan was a way of saying, I can do this too. When it was over, we lay there in silence for a while, both of us catching our breath. I could feel the satisfaction humming through my veins, but beneath it, there was something darker. This wasn't just about Amanda. This was about revenge and the realization that there was no going back from here. As Amanda got dressed, she smiled at me, that playful glint still in her eyes. That was unexpected, she said with a smirk. I nodded, though my thoughts were already spinning in 1,000 different directions. We should do this again sometime, she added, leaning in to kiss me one last time before heading for the door. As the door closed behind her, I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The rush of satisfaction was already starting to fade, replaced by the reality of what I had just done. I had crossed the line, more than one line actually. I had slept with my wife's best friend, and now I wasn't sure where it would end. But one thing was clear. Things were about to get a lot messy. The morning after, the weight of what I had done settled in like a cold fog. I didn't regret it. Not yet, but I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that I had unleashed something I couldn't control. The satisfaction I felt the night before, that raw energy I had poured into Amanda, had dimmed it to a hollow sense of uncertainty. What now? Where did this lead? I left the hotel and drove aimlessly for a while, not ready to go back home and face my wife. The anger still simmered, but now it was tangled with something else. Guilt, perhaps, or just the complexity of what I had set in motion. I hadn't expected to feel anything beyond vengeance. But now, in the aftermath, it felt like I had opened a door I couldn't easily shut. By the time I pulled into the driveway, it was late afternoon. The house looked the same as it always did. Calm, peaceful, a facade of normalcy. But everything inside was in chaos. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her face buried in her hands. She didn't look up when I walked in, and for a moment I stood there, unsure what to say. I had expected to feel powerful, vindicated after what I'd done. But instead, all I felt was the weight of what was still unresolved between us. Where were you last night? She asked, her voice muffled but laced with exhaustion. She didn't sound angry, just defeated. I needed space, I replied, walking past her toward the living room. I couldn't sit at that table with her, not yet. I thought maybe you weren't coming back. Her voice was quieter now, more vulnerable. I paused, my hand on the back of the couch. I wasn't sure if I would. The silence between us stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I could feel her gaze on me, but I didn't turn around. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I never wanted to hurt you like this. I let her words hang in the air for a moment before turning to face her. You didn't just hurt me. You broke us. You broke everything. She looked up at me, her eyes red from crying. I know I did. I wanted to feel something when I looked at her, anger, sadness, maybe even a flicker of the love we used to share. But I felt nothing. There was only emptiness where there used to be something so strong. Is there anything left to fix? She asked, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I didn't know the answer. All I knew was that the trust we once had was gone, shattered into a million pieces. I wasn't sure it could be rebuilt, even if I wanted to try. I slept with someone, I said, my voice cold and detached. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I saw the shock ripple across her face. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. With Amanda, I added, watching her reaction carefully. Her face paled, and she stood up so suddenly that the chair scraped loudly against the floor. What? Her voice was sharp now, disbelief and horror mixing together. You heard me. I felt no need to explain further. The truth was out now, and I could see it hit her like a blow she never saw coming. Her hands flew to her mouth, eyes welling up with tears again. But this time they weren't tears of regret or guilt. They were tears of pure betrayal. How could you? She whispered, her voice breaking. How could I? I repeated, the bitterness rising in my chest. How could you? You brought this on yourself. You opened this door. I just walked through it. She shook her head, backing away from me, her hand trembling as she wiped at her face. Not with her. Not with Amanda. Why not? I shot back. What difference does it make now? You were with Mark, with Andrew, with God knows who else. I thought we were keeping it honest. But no, you had secrets. So, why does it matter? Her face crumpled, and for the first time since this all began, I saw real fear in her eyes. She's my best friend, she choked out, her voice thick with emotion. I trusted you. I never thought you'd. I cut her off. You trusted me? You trusted me after you slept with another man behind my back? Don't talk to me about trust. I watched as she crumbled under the weight of her own choices. She sank back into the chair, tears flowing freely now. This wasn't supposed to happen, she whispered, more to herself than to me. None of this was supposed to happen. I stood there, arms crossed, feeling the tension pulse between us. I had imagined this moment so many times since the affair began, imagining what it would feel like to tell her about Amanda. I had thought it would feel good, that I'd get some sense of closure or satisfaction from watching her hurt the way I had. But all I felt was emptiness. I thought we were just experimenting, she sobbed. I never thought it would come to this. Well, it has, I said, my voice hard. And now we're both in it. The question is, what happens next? For the first time since this all started, she looked lost. The confident, assertive woman who had asked me for an open marriage was gone, replaced by someone broken, confused, desperate for something solid to hold on to. I don't know, she admitted, her voice trembling. I don't know what to do. Neither did I. But I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the marriage I wanted anymore. I wasn't sure if it was salvageable, and part of me didn't even care to try. I think we need time apart, I said finally, the words falling from my lips with a sense of finality. Her eyes widened in panic. Please don't leave, she begged. We can fix this. I know we can. But I shook my head. I don't think we can. I walked toward the door, grabbing my keys off the counter. I'll be staying somewhere else for a while. I need space to think. She didn't try to stop me as I left. The sound of the door closing behind me felt like the end of something. Maybe not the end of our marriage yet, but the end of whatever hope I had left that we could fix this. I left the house that night feeling like I had severed the final thread holding us together. As I drove away, the anger began to cool, leaving behind a hollow ache. The weight of everything, the open marriage, the infidelity, my own revenge was pressing down on me. I wasn't sure if I felt justified anymore. Sure, I had hurt her back, but what had I really gained? I spent the next week in a hotel, telling myself I needed the space to think, but in reality, I didn't think at all. Instead, I tried to drown out the noise in my head with anything I could. I went to bars, drank too much, and met women who were all too willing to help me forget. The first woman I slept with after Amanda was a blur of bad decisions and cheap thrills. There was no connection, no passion, just the cold, mechanical act of using someone to escape the mess my life had become. But that didn't stop me. I slept with another woman the following night, and another a few nights after that. Each one was a new distraction, a way to keep my mind off the disaster waiting for me back home. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about numbing the pain, filling the void that had grown too large to ignore. One morning, after a particularly rough night, I woke up to the harsh light of the hotel room cutting through the thin curtains. I had a pounding headache, my mouth dry and sour from too much alcohol, and the woman beside me, whose name I couldn't even remember, was still asleep, sprawled across the bed. As I stared at the ceiling, the emptiness I had been trying to outrun finally caught up with me. What was I doing? This wasn't me. This wasn't who I wanted to be. I sat up, quietly gathering my clothes, and slipped out of the room without waking her. The drive back to the hotel felt like a blur of shame and self-loathing. I pulled into the parking lot, sat in my car, and stared at the steering wheel for what felt like hours. How had it all come to this? How had I let things spiral so far out of control? The truth was I didn't recognize myself anymore. I had become someone I didn't like, someone who lashed out instead of dealing with the hurt, someone who ran from problems instead of facing them. Later that day, as I lay on the bed in my hotel room, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, expecting another message from her. But it wasn't. It was Amanda. We need to talk. Those 4 words sent a chill through me. I hadn't spoken to her since that night. and the weight of what we had done was still heavy on my conscience. I wasn't sure I was ready to deal with the fallout yet. But Amanda wasn't someone you ignored. I agreed to meet her later that evening, though my stomach twisted with dread at the thought. When I arrived at the small cafe we had chosen, I saw her sitting at a table by the window, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She looked up as I walked in, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, both of us knowing that what had happened between us had changed everything. "I'm not going to lie," she said quietly once I sat down. "I didn't expect this. I didn't expect you to, come to me. I didn't plan it," I admitted. "It just happened." She nodded, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. "Do you regret it?" I paused, thinking about the question. Did I regret it? The truth was I wasn't sure. Part of me regretted the way I had used her, the way I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But another part of me, the darker part, felt like I had needed that release, that moment of power in a world that had felt like it was falling apart. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know what I feel anymore." She sighed, leaning back in her chair, her gaze shifting to the window. "I always thought your marriage was different, stronger than most. I never expected you to be the one to, well, up here." "Neither did I," I said quietly. "But I don't think it's been strong for a long time." Amanda looked back at me, her eyes softening. "So what now? What happens with everything?" I knew what she was really asking. She wasn't just asking about my marriage. She was asking about us, about whether this was just a one-time thing or if it was something more. But I couldn't give her the answer she wanted. "I don't know what's going to happen," I said, my voice steady but firm. "But I don't think this U.S. was ever meant to be more than what it was. A mistake." She nodded, but I could see the hurt flash in her eyes before she masked it. "I figured you'd say that." I hated myself for hurting her too. Amanda had been caught in the crossfire of my anger and pain, and now she was paying the price for it. But I couldn't let her think there was a future here. There wasn't. All of this, my marriage, the open relationship, Amanda, it was a disaster I needed to walk away from. After a long silence, Amanda stood up, pushing her chair back. "I should go." I nodded, watching her leave, a heavy sense of finality settling in. The door to that part of my life was closing, and I knew there was no going back. When I returned to the hotel, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, wondering if I even knew the man staring back at me. Everything had spiraled so far out of control, and I wasn't sure how to put the pieces back together. But I knew one thing. I couldn't keep running. I needed to face what was waiting for me at home, even if it meant the end of everything. After I left Amanda at the cafe, something inside me shifted. There was no relief, no sense of closure, just a heavy, gnawing emptiness. The walls I had built around my emotions, the anger, the revenge, the desperate need to escape, were starting to crumble, leaving me exposed. I couldn't run anymore. I stayed in the hotel for another night, trying to figure out what my next move was. I had cut off contact with my wife for days, and though the silence had been a relief at first, it was starting to feel like I was avoiding the inevitable. The reality was waiting for me back at home, and it was time to face it, no matter how much it scared me. That next morning, I made the decision to go back. I had no idea what I would find when I walked through that door, but I knew I couldn't stay in limbo any longer. I needed answers about the baby, about us, about where we went from here. As I pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the house. It looked so peaceful, so normal from the outside, but I knew that what waited inside was anything but. When I stepped through the front door, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I called out her name, but there was no response. I wandered through the kitchen, the living room, but it wasn't until I reached the bedroom that I saw her, sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen. She had been crying. She looked up as I entered, but there was no anger in her eyes, no accusation. Just a deep sadness, one that I hadn't seen in her before. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "You came back," she said softly, her voice hoarse from tears. "I did." She nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I wasn't sure you would." I stood there, unsure of what to say. There was so much between us now, so much damage done. Could we even begin to put it into words? I don't know where to start, I admitted. Everything's such a mess. She wiped at her eyes, sniffling quietly. I know. I never meant for it to get this far. I never meant for any of this to happen. Her words stung, but I knew she was telling the truth. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about us, the choices we had both made, the boundaries we had crossed. I saw Amanda, I said, the confession slipping out before I could stop it. I wasn't sure why I was telling her, but I knew I needed to be honest, even if it hurt. She winced, her hand trembling as she wiped another tear from her cheek. I know, she whispered. She called me. I blinked in surprise. She did? She nodded, her eyes filled with a pain I hadn't expected. She told me everything. About that night, about you too. She wanted to apologize, I think, but I didn't want to hear it. I felt a pit forming in my stomach. I hadn't anticipated Amanda telling her, hadn't thought about what that might mean. Why didn't you say anything? She looked away, biting her lip. What was I supposed to say? That I'm mad at you for doing the exact same thing I did? That I feel betrayed when I was the one who opened this door in the first place? She shook her head, her voice breaking. I can't be mad at you. Not when I've hurt you so much more. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of her words sinking in. It was the first time she had admitted the depth of the hurt between us. The first time she had acknowledged the devastation we had both caused. I slept with 3 other women, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. After Amanda. I didn't care. I just wanted to forget. She looked up at me, her face crumpling in disbelief. 3. I nodded, shame coursing through me as I saw the hurt flash in her eyes. I had wanted her to feel my pain, but now that I wasn't sure if I could handle it. I didn't want it to mean anything, I said, my voice trembling. I was angry. I was lost. I thought if I hurt you the way you hurt me, it would make everything better. But it didn't. It just made things worse. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly, and I felt the full weight of what we had done to each other. We were both to blame, both guilty of tearing apart the love we had once shared. I'm sorry, she whispered through her tears. I'm so sorry. I am too, I said, sitting down beside her. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something besides anger, grief. Grief for what we had lost, for the trust we had destroyed, for the future we had thrown away. I don't know how to fix this, she said, her voice breaking. I don't know if it can be fixed. I didn't know either. As much as I wanted to, as much as I wished we could go back to the way things were, the reality was that too much had happened. Too many lines had been crossed. The baby, her infidelity, my revenge, it was all too much to repair. Maybe we can't, I said softly, feeling the words settle heavily between us. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with fear. Are you saying you want to leave? I didn't know how to answer. Part of me did want to leave, to walk away from the wreckage of our marriage and start over somewhere else, free from the pain and betrayal that clung to us like a shadow. But another part of me, one that was harder to admit, still loved her, still wanted to find a way to make it work. I don't know, I admitted, my voice thick with emotion. But I think we need time, space to figure out what we want. Her lip trembled, and she nodded slowly, wiping at her face. I understand. We sat in silence for a while longer, neither of us sure of what to say next. The gravity of what lay ahead of us was sinking in. Whether we stayed together or not, nothing would ever be the same. I'll move out for now, I said finally. I'll give you space. Her face crumpled again, but she didn't argue. Okay, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I stood up, feeling the weight of my decision settle over me. This wasn't the end. Not yet. But it was the beginning of the end, and we both knew it. As I walked out the door, I heard her sob quietly behind me. The sound tore at my heart, but I kept walking, knowing that no matter what happened next, there was no going back. The decision to move out wasn't easy, but it felt necessary. For weeks, I stayed at a friend's place, trying to make sense of the chaos my life had become. The quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts were the worst. I kept replaying everything over and over. The open marriage, the lies, the affairs, the baby. There was no escaping it. The guilt, the anger, the betrayal, all of it clung to me like a second skin. But the real blow came when the scandal broke. It started innocuously enough, with whispers. Amanda, despite everything, hadn't kept quiet. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe she wanted to justify what had happened between us, but somehow the story started to spread. A few mutual friends knew, and from there, it didn't take long for the rumor mill to churn out its worst. It wasn't just about my affair with Amanda. It was about the open marriage, the pregnancy, the tangled web of infidelity. Soon, people I barely knew were whispering behind my back, giving me sideways glances whenever I walked into a room. I could feel the judgment in every look, the disbelief in every awkward silence. The hardest part wasn't the gossip, though. It was the way people started treating my wife. Her betrayal had been private until now, but once Amanda's story started making the rounds, everything we had tried to keep quiet became public knowledge. My wife, who was already fragile, was dragged into the spotlight of our social circle, and the shame weighed heavily on her. One day, while I was at work, I got a text from her. "We need to talk. It's about the baby." My heart dropped. We hadn't discussed the baby much since the paternity test. The reality that the baby wasn't mine had been a wedge between us, and I hadn't been able to wrap my head around it fully. What more was there to talk about? When I got to the house that evening, she was waiting for me at the door, her face drawn and pale. I hadn't been back here since I moved out, and seeing her standing there, so fragile, made me feel an unexpected pang of sympathy. "Come in," she said quietly. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where she had first proposed the open marriage all those months ago. Everything about the room felt heavy with the weight of that decision. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice cautious. She hesitated, wringing her hands together nervously before she spoke. "There's something I need to tell you. About the baby." I frowned, leaning forward. "What about the baby?" She closed her eyes, as if bracing herself for what she was about to say. "It's not Mark's." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, my mind racing. "What do you mean?" "The paternity test said." She cut me off, her voice trembling. "I know what it said, but there's more. Mark isn't the only one. There was someone else." The room seemed to tilt around me as I struggled to process what she was saying. "Another man. Another betrayal." "Who?" I asked, my voice hardening with anger. She looked down, unable to meet my gaze. "It was a one-time thing. After Mark." I was confused, scared. I didn't know what I was doing. The fury inside me bubbled up, threatening to spill over. "Who is he?" She whispered his name, but it didn't matter. He was just another in a long line of lies and betrayals that had destroyed everything we had built. The man's name didn't matter, only that he existed, that she had crossed yet another line I hadn't even known was there. The room fell into a tense silence. I stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman I had married with the stranger sitting across from me now. The woman who had lied, cheated, and dragged us both through this hell. "I don't even know who you are anymore," I said quietly, the words heavy with the finality of it all. She didn't argue. She just sat there, tears sliding down her cheeks, knowing that the damage was beyond repair. "I think we should get a divorce," I said finally, the words cutting through the silence like a knife. She sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "I never wanted this," she cried. "I never wanted any of this to happen." "Neither did I," I said coldly. "But it's too late for that now." We sat there in the wreckage of our marriage, both of us knowing there was nothing left to salvage. The open marriage, the lies, the betrayal. It had all led us here, to this moment of complete and utter destruction. I left the house that night, knowing it was for the last time. There was no going back, no fixing what we had broken. I filed for divorce the next week, the paperwork cold and impersonal. A fitting end to the love that had once felt so vibrant and real. But the scandal didn't end there. Word of our impending divorce spread quickly, fueled by the rumors that had already been circulating. People whispered about the open marriage, the affairs, the baby that wasn't mine. It became the kind of gossip that people couldn't resist, the scandal of the year. And as much as I tried to stay above it, the reality was that my life had become tabloid fodder, for everyone we knew. One afternoon, about a week after the divorce papers were filed, I ran into Amanda. It wasn't planned. We were both at the same cafe, and she spotted me before I could leave unnoticed. She walked over to me, her expression hesitant. "Can we talk?" I didn't have the energy to say no, so I nodded, gesturing for her to sit. "How are you?" she asked quietly, her voice full of concern. I shrugged, not really knowing how to answer. "Getting through it, I guess." She looked down at her coffee, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "I'm sorry. For everything." I let out a sigh, feeling the weight of the past few months pressing down on me. "It's not all your fault, Amanda. We were both part of this mess." She nodded, her eyes softening as she looked at me. "I never wanted things to get so out of hand. I never wanted to hurt you." I believed her. Amanda had been caught up in the same storm that had wrecked my marriage, and though she had been part of the chaos, I didn't blame her. "Not entirely, anyway. I've been thinking a lot," she continued. "About us. About what happened between us." I tensed, unsure of where this conversation was going. "I know it wasn't just revenge for you," she said softly, her eyes searching mine. "Was it?" I hesitated, but the truth was she was right. It hadn't just been about revenge. There had been something real between us, something undeniable. And as much as I wanted to push her away, I couldn't ignore the pull I still felt. "No," I admitted. "It wasn't just revenge." She reached out, her hand brushing against mine. Maybe we could try again. This time without all the lies." Her words hung in the air between us, full of possibility. I didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of hope. The days after Amanda and I spoke at the cafe felt surreal, as though I was finally stepping out of the wreckage and into something new. For the first time in months, the weight of the betrayal and chaos started to lift, if only slightly. The divorce papers were filed, and there was no turning back now. As painful as it was to admit, the life I had once known with my wife was over. But with that ending came the possibility of something new, something with Amanda. I didn't dive into it right away. Both of us knew that moving forward too quickly, especially after everything that had happened, would be reckless. We were cautious, careful not to repeat the mistakes we had made before. But there was an undeniable connection between us, something that had been lingering beneath the surface long before our affair had ever started. And now, without the lies, without the secret guilt, we were free to explore what that connection really meant. We started slowly. Casual dinners, long walks where we talked about everything and nothing. There was no rush to define what we were or where it was going. I think we both needed that time to heal, to figure out who we were without the mess of betrayal hanging over us. As for my wife, or more accurately, my soon-to-be ex-wife, we kept our distance. The divorce process was as civil as it could be, considering the circumstances. We had agreed to keep things simple, to divide our assets evenly and avoid dragging things out in court. The house would be sold, and we'd go our separate ways. There was no more fighting, no more anger. Just two people untangling their lives from one another. I thought about her a lot during that time, not in the way I used to, but more in a reflective sense. I wondered how she was coping with everything, with the scandal that had followed her after the truth about her pregnancy and affairs came to light. I knew people were talking, our friends, our colleagues, even strangers who had heard bits of the story through the grapevine. She had become a kind of pariah in our circle, and though part of me felt like she deserved it, another part of me couldn't help but feel a little sad for her. We had both made mistakes, and we were both paying the price. One afternoon, just a few weeks after our conversation at the cafe, Amanda invited me over to her place. It wasn't anything special, just a quiet evening, cooking dinner together, something we hadn't done before. When I arrived, she greeted me at the door with a warm smile that immediately put me at ease. She looked different, less guarded, more open, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. The evening was simple but perfect. We cooked, laughed, and talked about everything that wasn't related to our past. There were no lingering shadows of the affair or the open marriage that had destroyed my life. It was just us two people starting over, finding something real in the aftermath of so much pain. After dinner, we sat on the couch, the quiet hum of the city filtering through the open window. Amanda leaned into me, her head resting on my shoulder. It felt natural, like this was where we were supposed to be all along. "I've been thinking," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "About what?" "About us," she said, lifting her head to look at me. "I know things have been complicated, and I know we both need time to figure things out. But I want you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Her words hit me with a strange sense of relief. After everything, after the lies, the secrets, the chaos, she was still here, still willing to stand by me, even as the rest of my life fell apart. I reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I'm not going anywhere either." She smiled, leaning in to kiss me softly. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the kiss wasn't filled with desperation or anger. It wasn't about revenge or proving something to myself. It was just about being with her, in that moment, without the weight of the past hanging over us. As the night wore on, we ended up in bed together again, but this time it felt different, softer, more real. There was no guilt, no hidden motives, just the two of us, finding solace in each other, healing in ways I hadn't expected. The connection between us wasn't just physical anymore. It was deeper, more meaningful. The next morning, as the sun filtered through the curtains, I found myself lying beside her, watching her sleep. For the first time in months, I felt peaceful. I hadn't felt that way in a long time. Not since before the open marriage, before the lies. Over the next few weeks, Amanda and I grew closer. Slowly but surely, we began to rebuild our lives. Not as the people who had hurt each other, but as something new. We kept things private at first. After the scandal, we didn't want to give people more fuel for their gossip. But it didn't take long for the whispers to start again. Somehow, word got out that Amanda and I were seeing each other. It was inevitable, I suppose, given how close we were. People speculated, judged, and gossiped. I knew what they were saying. That I had left my wife for her best friend, that we had been carrying on an affair all along, that we were both to blame for everything that had happened. But I didn't care. For the first time, I wasn't looking over my shoulder, worrying about what people thought. What mattered was that we were building something new, something real. And despite everything, Amanda and I were happy. We hadn't expected this to happen, hadn't planned for it. But life had a way of taking you places you never thought you'd go, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path. The divorce was finalized a few months later. My wife and I parted ways without much ceremony. There were no more fights, no more accusations. Just two signatures on a piece of paper that marked the official end of a marriage that had been dying long before we realized it. In the end, the scandal faded, as scandals always do. People moved on, found new gossip to sink their teeth into, and we were left to pick up the pieces of our lives. Amanda and I grew closer with each passing day, finding comfort in the fact that, despite the mess we had created, we had found something worth holding on to. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, still lingering guilt about how it had all started. But in those quiet moments, when it was just the two of us, I knew that what we had was real. And that was enough. The months that followed felt like a slow return to normalcy, or at least a new version of it. My divorce had officially gone through, and the chapter of my life that I had spent with my ex-wife was finally closed. Amanda and I were together, but we were taking things one day at a time, letting the dust settle from the chaos that had uprooted both of our lives. People talked, of course. There were still whispers, still those lingering looks when we walked into a room together. Friends had distanced themselves, either out of judgment or discomfort. Some had sided with my ex-wife, others stayed neutral, and a few, those rare few, had accepted that life was messy, that none of us had come out of this situation unscathed. I had expected the judgment to bother me more than it did. I had prepared myself for the gossip, for the endless speculation about whether Amanda and I had been together all along. But as the weeks turned into months, I found that I cared less and less about what other people thought. My energy was focused on rebuilding my life, on moving forward with Amanda, and on letting go of the anger and resentment that had defined me for so long. My ex-wife, on the other hand, had mostly disappeared from my life. We didn't speak, not beyond the legalities of the divorce. And even those conversations were brief and impersonal. I didn't know where she had gone after the house was sold, and I didn't ask. I hoped she was finding her own way forward, dealing with her choices the best she could. There was no point in holding on to the bitterness. It had consumed both of us long enough. One afternoon, a few months after the divorce was finalized, I got a message from a mutual friend of ours. They hadn't reached out in a while, but the message was simple and to the point. "Did you hear? She's leaving the city." Apparently, my ex-wife had decided to move away, maybe to start over somewhere where her past wouldn't follow her like a shadow. I couldn't blame her. The scandal had taken its toll on both of us, and for her, staying in the city meant being constantly reminded of her mistakes. I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief when I heard the news. Sadness for what we had lost, but relief that she was finally moving on. Maybe, in time, we'd both be able to heal. As for Amanda and me, our relationship continued to grow. There were moments of doubt, of course. We had both been through so much, and there were times when the weight of our past choices hung over us like a cloud. But those moments were fleeting, and we were learning to trust each other in ways we hadn't before. The connection that had brought us together was deeper now, built on something more than just physical attraction or shared history. I remember one night in particular, as we lay in bed, the soft hum of the city outside our window. Amanda turned to me, her hand resting on my chest, her eyes searching mine. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. What we did. It was a question I had asked myself many times. There were nights when I wondered if we could have handled things differently, if there was another path we could have taken that wouldn't have led to so much destruction. But as I looked into her eyes, I knew the answer. "No," I said softly. "I regret how it happened, how messy everything got. But I don't regret you. I don't regret us." She smiled, her hand gently squeezing mine. "I don't either. It wasn't that we were ignoring the past. We both knew what we had done to get here, the pain we had caused, and the lies we had upended. But we had learned to live with it, to accept that sometimes life doesn't unfold the way you expect. Sometimes it takes a disaster to find out what really matters." We spent that summer building a life together, slowly but surely. We took trips out of town, just the two of us, escaping the city and all the memories that haunted it. We explored new places, laughed more than we had in years, and began to imagine a future that wasn't weighed down by guilt or regret. There was still healing to be done, but we were doing it together, and that made all the difference. As time passed, the gossip died down, as gossip always does. People moved on, found new stories to fixate on, and Amanda and I were left to live our lives without the constant scrutiny. Some friends returned, while others stayed distant. But in the end, we realized that what mattered most was the life we were building for ourselves, not what anyone else thought. The last time I saw my ex-wife was unexpected. It was at a mutual friend's party, one of the few social events I still attended with the same group of people. She had come back to the city for a visit, and though we hadn't spoken since the divorce, there was no tension when we ran into each other that night. We exchanged polite greetings, nothing more, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet acceptance. We had both been through hell, and somehow we had come out on the other side, changed but still standing. As I watched her walk away that night, I felt a sense of closure. Whatever anger or sadness I had felt toward her was gone, replaced by a kind of peace. We had both made mistakes, we had both paid the price, and now we were free to live our lives, however messy they might be. Amanda and I moved in together later that year. It was a big step, one that neither of us took lightly, but it felt right. We were building something new, something real, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Life didn't go back to the way it had been before, but that was okay. I had learned that sometimes the things that break us are the very things that lead us to where we need to be. Amanda and I were proof of that. We had found each other in the wreckage, and somehow, against all odds, we had built something strong. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Thank you for joining us for this touching journey of love, betrayal, and redemption. We hope it resonated with you, even brought a little inspiration. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts and reactions in the comments. Feel free to share your own experiences or let us know what kinds of stories you'd like to see next. Thanks again for your support. Until then, take care and stay tuned for more great content.